I'd been driving for 3 straight days. The endless blacktop stretched out before me, the only company being the hum of my engine and the occasional passing headlights. I liked it that way, no distractions, just me and the road. But that night felt different. The air was heavy, like something was hanging over me. It started when my CB radio crackled with static, which wasn't unusual for these parts, but what came through after wasn't your typical trucker banter. Help! It was faint, barely audible, like someone was whispering into the receiver from miles away. I glanced down at the radio, twisting the knob to clear the static, thinking it was some kind of joke. Help me, please. I gripped the wheel tighter, my eyes flicking up to the dark highway ahead. There was nothing, just the empty stretch of road, the darkness closing in on both sides, and my headlights cutting through it. My heart started beating a little faster. I'd heard of CB pranks before, but this one felt wrong. Then, as if someone had flipped a switch, the voice became crystal clear. I'm on the road. I can see your lights. I slammed my foot on the brake, the truck screeching to a halt in the middle of the highway. My breath hitched in my throat. Who the hell was out there? I scanned the road ahead, my high beams reaching far into the distance, but nothing, no sign of life. Yet the voice sounded close. Too close. My hand hovered over the radio, debating whether to answer, but before I could even make a move, the voice spoke again. Behind you. My blood ran cold. Without thinking, I snapped my head around, staring through the rearview mirror. The red glow of my taillights illuminated the empty road behind me, but there was something else, a shadow just beyond the light's reach, barely visible. I blinked, straining my eyes, trying to make sense of it. It didn't move, just stood there, motionless in the darkness. I felt like I was losing my mind. Was it a trick of the light? The road playing games with me after too many hours behind the wheel? Or was something watching me? Shaking off the chill crawling up my spine, I threw the truck into gear and hit the gas. My tires spun for a second before catching, and I sped off down the highway, the radio silent once again. But no matter how fast I went, the feeling wouldn't leave me. It clung to me like a wet fog, the sensation that I wasn't alone anymore. The next few hours were a blur of asphalt and darkness, the paranoia gnawing at the edges of my sanity. I needed to pull over, clear my head. I spotted a small rest stop up ahead, the kind that barely had enough space for a few cars and a vending machine. I pulled in, turned off the engine, and sat in the silence. The moment I opened the door, the cold night air hit me, making me shiver. But it wasn't just the temperature. The atmosphere felt thick, suffocating. The rest stop was deserted, not even another truck in sight, just an old payphone and a flickering streetlight casting long, eerie shadows across the cracked pavement. I made my way to the vending machine, trying to shake off the creeping fear. My hands fumbled for change as I stared into the glass, but something caught my eye. A reflection. There in the glass, standing just beyond the reach of the streetlight, was a figure. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The figure was tall, its outline distorted by the flickering light. It didn't move. Just stood there, watching me. I could feel its eyes, though I couldn't see a face. The vending machine's hum seemed louder, the only sound cutting through the suffocating silence. I turned slowly, my heart pounding in my ears. But when I looked, there was nothing. Just the empty lot, the quiet stretch of highway beyond, and the distant whine of the wind. No figure, no shadow. My body was shaking, but I didn't know if it was from the cold or the creeping terror that something was playing with me. Maybe it was the exhaustion. Maybe the hours of driving were catching up, but I felt wrong. Like the world had shifted slightly off balance, and I was the only one who noticed. I stuffed the can of soda into my jacket pocket and hurried back to the truck, glancing over my shoulder every few steps, half expecting to see that shadow following me. The driver's seat felt like the only safe place in the world, and the moment the door shut behind me, I locked it, double-checking out of habit. The dashboard lights flickered to life, and I gripped the wheel, ready to hit the road again. I needed to get out of there. As I pulled out of the lot, the radio crackled back to life. You can't leave. My stomach dropped. I didn't respond. I wouldn't. But then, just as I was about to turn the dial, the voice spoke again, clearer this time. I'm already inside. I slammed on the brakes, my body jolting forward against the seatbelt. My heart was racing, hammering so hard in my chest I thought it might burst. The cab of the truck was quiet, too quiet. I slowly looked over at the passenger seat, and my blood ran ice cold. There was a figure sitting there. I couldn't see its face, only the vague outline of a person, hunched over, staring straight ahead like it had been there the entire time. My hands tightened on the wheel until my knuckles turned white. My mind raced, scrambling for an explanation, anything to make sense of the impossible. I blinked, and the figure was gone. I gasped, sucking in air like I'd been holding my breath for hours. My hands were trembling, sweat trickling down my neck. It wasn't real. It couldn't be. I was just tired, right? Just exhausted. But then the smell hit me. A foul stench, like something rotting thick and sour, filling the cab. I gagged, covering my mouth, and for a moment, I swore I heard breathing, raspy, shallow breaths coming from the passenger seat. I didn't dare look again. My hands fumbled as I threw the truck into gear and floored it, the engine roaring to life as I sped down the highway, not caring where I was going, just needing to get away. But as the miles blurred by, the smell stayed. That sickening, putrid stench. It clung to me, filling my nose, coating my throat. I tried opening the window, letting the freezing night air rush in, but it didn't help. I was suffocating in it. And then the whispers started. Low, guttural, like a chorus of voices just beyond the edge of hearing, seeping into my mind. They were inside my head, scratching at the back of my brain, but I couldn't make out the words. I turned the radio off, but it didn't stop. I wasn't alone in that truck. I knew it now. Something had gotten in. Something was with me. The highway stretched on forever, but I had nowhere to go. I couldn't shake the feeling. Every mile I drove felt like I was sinking deeper into something I couldn't escape from, like I was trapped in a nightmare that stretched out with the road itself. The stench was unbearable now, thick enough that I could almost taste it, rotten and sour, as if something had crawled inside the truck and died. But I kept driving. It was the only thing I could do. If I stopped again, I knew something worse was waiting for me. The CB radio crackled again. "Keep driving," the voice rasped. I hadn't touched the radio since that first transmission, but now the static buzzed constantly, like someone was toying with a dial. Every few seconds the static would break, and I'd hear something, a voice, faint and distant, whispering things I couldn't quite catch. I turned the radio off, but the whispers kept bleeding through, crawling into my mind. I glanced into the rearview mirror again, expecting to see nothing but empty highway behind me. I was wrong. There, in the dim glow of my taillights, was the shadow. It was closer now, clearer. I couldn't make out details, but it was tall, hunched over, and it seemed to sway as I drove. My stomach twisted as I realized it was following me, no, chasing me. I gripped the wheel tighter and pressed my foot harder on the gas. The engine roared, but the shadow didn't fall away. It stayed right there, at the edge of the light, moving with the truck like it was tethered to me. The faster I went, the closer it seemed to get. Then, the lights began to flicker. First, it was just a brief flicker, something I might have ignored on any other night. But then it happened again, longer this time, the road ahead plunging into darkness before the headlights sputtered back on. The shadow behind me didn't seem to care. If anything, it looked like it was enjoying this. My knuckles were white on the wheel now, every muscle in my body tensed as I tried to focus on the road. But the lights kept flickering, plunging me into brief moments of total blackness. And every time the darkness swallowed the truck, I could feel something shift beside me. The figure. It was in the truck again. I didn't want to look, but I could feel it. The air had changed, colder now, like the very presence of this thing was draining the heat from the cab. I could hear it too, the soft, raspy breathing from before, filling the small space. I dared a glance at the passenger seat. It was sitting there, clear as day now, though its form seemed to waver and blur, like smoke trapped in the shape of a person. Its head was turned towards me, but I couldn't see a face. Just darkness. A void where its features should be. But I could feel its eyes on me, piercing through the shadows, staring straight into my soul. "Don't stop," it whispered. I nearly lost control of the truck, the wheels skidding for a second before I straightened it out. My breath came in shallow gasps, panic clawing at my throat. My mind was racing, trying to find some kind of logic, something that would make sense of all this, but there was nothing. "Don't stop, or it'll get you." The voice was soft, almost soothing, but there was something else beneath it, something cold and malicious. I could feel it seeping into my thoughts, twisting them, making me doubt everything. Was I even awake? Was this some kind of sick hallucination brought on by exhaustion? But the shadow was real. I knew that much. I slammed my foot down on the gas, the engine groaning as I pushed the truck as hard as it would go. The highway whipped past me in a blur, but I didn't care anymore. I just needed to get away. Away from the shadow, away from the thing in my truck, away from whatever nightmare I'd stumbled into. But no matter how fast I drove, the shadow was always there, looming just at the edge of my sight, growing closer with every flicker of the headlights. Then, in one heart-stopping moment, the lights died completely. I was plunged into total darkness. The truck shuddered, the engine choking as if something had grabbed hold of it, and for a split second, I thought it was over. The truck slowed to a crawl, and the smell, Oh God, the smell intensified, like the air itself was rotting. I gripped the wheel, my pulse hammering in my ears, and in the darkness, I heard it again. Behind you. Every nerve in my body screamed not to turn around, but I couldn't help it. Slowly, painfully, I twisted in my seat, my eyes straining to see in the pitch blackness. And there it was. The shadow, no longer at the edge of the light, but right behind me inside the truck now, looming over the back of my seat. I could feel its breath on the back of my neck, cold and damp, and I knew, if I didn't do something, it would take me. Without thinking, I slammed my fist into the dashboard, hitting every button I could find. The lights flickered back on, weak at first, but strong enough to chase the darkness away. The shadow was gone. I didn't stop to think. I hit the gas, the truck lurching forward as I sped down the highway, the engine roaring back to life. My heart was still pounding, but I didn't look back again. I couldn't. I wouldn't. I just kept driving. But no matter how far I went, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still with me. I had no idea how long I'd been driving. The highway felt endless, the darkness around me suffocating, but the shadow hadn't reappeared. Not yet, anyway. I kept my eyes glued to the road, afraid to blink, terrified that if I did, I'd see it again in the rearview mirror. The radio had gone silent, the whispers finally gone. The only sound now was the engine's hum and my own ragged breathing. My knuckles were raw from gripping the wheel, my muscles aching from hours of tension. I was exhausted, every nerve in my body frayed to its limit. But I couldn't stop. Not until I was sure I was safe. Then, up ahead, I saw it. Adina. It stood alone on the side of the highway, its neon sign flickering weakly in the night. The sight of it hit me like a punch to the gut. A lifeline. Somewhere, anywhere, other than this truck. I didn't think twice. I veered off the road, the tires screeching as I pulled into the parking lot. The place looked deserted, the windows dark except for the faint glow of a light inside. But I didn't care. I needed to get out of the truck. I needed to feel the ground under my feet, to breathe air that wasn't tainted by that stench. I killed the engine and stumbled out of the cab, slamming the door behind me. The cold air hit me like a wave, but it was a relief, sharp and clean, cutting through the haze in my mind. For a moment, I just stood there, gulping down the night air, my body shaking with exhaustion and fear. The shadow was gone. But I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. Not yet. I made my way to the diner, my boots crunching on the gravel. The neon sign buzzed overhead, casting a sickly glow on the cracked pavement. I reached the door and hesitated, my hand hovering over the handle. Something felt off. But before I could talk myself out of it, I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The diner was empty. Silent. The kind of place that looked like it hadn't seen a customer in years. The booths were cracked, the linoleum floor peeling, and the jukebox in the corner looked like it hadn't played a song since the 70s. But the air was warm. Too warm. Stifling, like the smell of grease and something else. Something familiar. That same, rotten stench. I froze. I wasn't alone. I glanced around, my heart pounding in my chest, and that's when I saw him. A man, sitting in one of the far booths, his back to me. He was slumped over, his shoulders hunched, his hands resting on the table in front of him. I couldn't see his face, but something about him made my skin crawl. "Hey," I called out, my voice hoarse. He didn't move. I took a step closer, my boots echoing in the empty diner. "You okay?" Still nothing. I was close now, close enough to see the grime caked under his fingernails, the way his clothes hung loose on his thin frame. I swallowed hard, a knot forming in my stomach. Something was very, very wrong. "Sir." I reached out, my hand trembling, and tapped him on the shoulder. He turned. I stumbled back, my heart leaping into my throat. His face, it wasn't a face. It was a shadow, a black void where his features should have been, just like the thing that had been in my truck. His head tilted, as if he was staring at me, but there were no eyes. No mouth. Just darkness. "I told you," a voice whispered, low and guttural. It wasn't coming from the figure in front of me. It was coming from behind. I spun around, my pulse spiking, and there it was. The shadow. It stood by the door, tall and looming, blocking my only way out. Its form shifted, twisting like smoke, but it had substance now. I could feel the weight of its presence pressing down on me, suffocating. "You can't run." I backed away, my heart hammering in my chest, but there was nowhere to go. The diner was a trap, a dead end. And I knew in that moment that the thing in front of me wasn't the only one. There were more. Shadows shifting in the corners of the diner, figures I hadn't noticed before, rising from the booths, stepping out of the darkness. They were everywhere. Panic surged through me, and I turned back to the door, desperate to escape. But the shadow blocked my path, its form rippling, growing taller, stretching across the walls and ceiling. I was trapped. Then, in one horrifying instant, the shadow lunged. It moved faster than anything I'd ever seen, enveloping me in cold, suffocating darkness. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. My mind was a whirlwind of terror, my body frozen in place as the thing wrapped itself around me, pulling me into the void. But then, it stopped. The darkness receded, pulling away like smoke on the wind, and I found myself standing alone in the diner.
The shadows wäre gone.
The man, the figures, they had vanished. Even the stench was fading, replaced by the clean, cold air of the night. I was alive. I staggered out of the diner, my legs shaking, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The truck was still there, sitting in the lot, waiting for me. But I couldn't go back to it. Not after what had happened. Not after what I'd seen. I didn't know what that thing was. I didn't know why it had let me go. But as I stood there, staring out at the empty highway, I realized something.
It wasn't over.
It was never over. And no matter how far I drove, no matter where I went, that thing, those shadows, they would always be with me. Waiting. Watching. And one day, they'd come back for me. The road is a lonely place. But nothing is lonelier than knowing you're never truly alone.